Huh, he really just went and killed his wife with a rock.
Apparently so.
Did he also do that in the book?
Actually, he didn't. In the book, he was still at the stepstones, and his wife had a riding accident. She even seemed to have recovered from it, but then just died. Only then did Demon return to the Vale, but...
Wait, what the hell is that?
We heard what you said, loud and clear.
What did I say?
That in the books, Damon didn't kill Rhea Royce.
Why are you angry?
You're so dumb. Fire and blood is unreliable. Nobody knows what really happened.
Yes. All of this is made up. Nothing in that book can't be believed. It's all up to interpretation.
Please, get out of my house.
I'm calling the police.
Before we start, remember that if you like my content, like, subscribe and share, so that more people can see it. Make sure to click the notification button so that you never miss a new video. Also, you can listen to this on Spotify if you prefer. Check the link in the description. According to archaeological research, the oldest thus far known remains of the species of Homo sapiens are around 300,000 years old. They come from Jebel Irhoud, Morocco. Around this time, Homo sapiens saw a level of advancement, making sophisticated stone tools that greatly improved their hunting prowess and changed their relationship to ecosystems. The oldest remains of Homo sapiens found outside of Africa are believed to be 210,000 to 100,000 years old, which gives strength to the hypothesis that our species originated precisely in Africa. 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, a landmark migration out of Africa to the Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East took place, likely prompted by changes in climate, which lowered sea levels. Genetic studies show that all human beings on Earth, aside from Africans, can trace their genetic lineage to those who undertook said migration, as this group eventually spread all over the Earth. Throughout this time, Homo sapiens was not the only human-like species that inhabited the Earth. We coexisted and interbred with other species, including those who are yet to be identified. To this day, human beings carry traces of Neanderthal DNA. However, 50,000 to 40,000 years ago, these other species were just a memory, and the only humanoid species that remained was Homo sapiens. Written language first became a thing in 3500 BC, in the first known human civilization of Mesopotamia. The Epic of Gilgamesh comes precisely from that place, and it is the oldest known surviving literary work. Thus, 5th century BC is when the long period of proto-history ends, and history itself, that is, what was actually written down and recorded, starts. Why do I mention all this? One reason is because I cry at the club whenever I think of Neanderthals and need you guys to cry with me, but also because I want to put something into perspective. Most of the history of the species of Homo sapiens was not recorded anywhere, since the invention of the written word came so late. All that we know of our Homo sapiens ancestors comes from archaeological research and DNA analysis. Homo sapiens began recording their legacy only 500,000 years ago. And as you remember, the oldest remains of Homo sapiens are believed to be 300,000 years old. This means that 99% of the history of our species is unknown to us. Luckily, from that moment onward, history was recorded, from the Greeks to the Romans, to the European kingdoms of the Middle Ages, and finally modernity. The scope and quality of sources increased with every new invention. Now, everyone can be a chronicler of history. All you need is a smartphone. When analyzing history, we broadly have two types of sources we can take our information from: primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are first-hand accounts from people who had a direct connection with it or witnessed them themselves. They may take the form of original documents of laws, newspaper reports, speeches, diaries, letters, interviews, original researches, datasets, censuses, economic statistics, photographs, video or audio. Secondary sources, on the other hand, are one step removed from primary sources. They usually add a layer of interpretation or analysis and consist of things like books on the topic, analysis or interpretation of data, scholarly articles on the topic, and documentaries. Secondary sources tend to use primary sources as a basis. For instance, the document of the United States Declaration of Independence is a primary source, but a school textbook that discusses and analyzes it will be a secondary source that uses it as a primary source. Note that this does not only apply to history. For example, a critical review of a novel will be a secondary source, while the novel itself will be a primary source. Since history is recorded by human beings and no human being is completely impartial, both primary and secondary sources may be biased, and it should be taken into account. It is a duty of a historian to acknowledge the context in which a primary source exists and potential biases it may contain. For instance, when analyzing a diary of a Nazi soldier, you should ask yourself where his allegiances lay and what he potentially exaggerated or made up to justify his participation in genocide. Technically, it is considered unethical for a historian crafting a secondary source to heavily lean into those biases, but this is often inevitable. One way to avoid such a bias is to use a wide variety of sources, including the ones that are not in line with their line of thinking. Historians also don't exist in a bubble. There are systems in place that help combat inevitable biases. Correct methodology and the scientific method come to mind, as well as the pressure of academic peers. Secondary sources such as books and articles are verified and reviewed before they are published, so that the bias might be kept in check. Of course, it's important to always treat those with a grain of salt as well, but that does not keep our own bias at bay either, does it? Well, sometimes there are just no clear-cut answers. And that exactly is the case with Fire and Blood. Fire and Blood is a book written by George R.R. Martin, but styled like a history book written by Archmeister Gildane, who is a character living in his fictional universe. George himself studied history in Northwestern University Medill School of Journalism, so he is certainly well familiar with primary and secondary sources, as well as the inherent biases they carry. That was one of the reasons he wrote Fire and Blood in this way. I'm not just going to do a history. I'm going to do a history written a couple hundred years later. And when you're writing, you have an idea for a scene. Then you have a different idea for a scene. Oh, which one should I go with? I will go with this one. I will go with that one. Well, that one's too wild. People will never believe it. You tend to go with the conservative scene. But with that, I could have it both ways. I could say that this is how Septon Eustace said it went. And this is how Grand Maester Orwell said it went. And this is how Mushroom said it went. And you pick one. You pick which one, because we don't know. Or Maester Gildane doesn't know. Thus, Fire and Blood is a secondary source written by Archmeister Gildane that uses several sources, both primary and secondary, to tell a story. And it's important to note that Gildane documented different periods of different times. As such, for each segment, he used sources left by different chronicles, which is self-explanatory since almost 2 centuries passed and nobody lives that long. There are huge differences in due diligence of these sources, and Gildane himself acknowledges it. More than 40 men have served the Iron Throne as Grand Maester. Their journals, letters, account books, memoirs, and court calendars are our single best record of the events they witnessed, but not all of them were equally diligent. Whereas some left us volumes of letters full of empty words, never failing to note what the king ate for supper and whether he enjoyed it, others set down no more than a half-dozen missives a year. In this regard, Bennifer ranks near the top, and his letters and journals provide us with detailed accounts of all that he saw, did, and witnessed whilst in service to King Jaehaerys and his uncle Maegor before him. Bennifer is noted to have been very diligent and left excellent primary sources. This is why we know so much of Jaehaerys' reign, and why there is little left up to imagination. Even the personal dramas between everyone involved were recorded in detail. It is the dance sections that have the most conflicting reports, as Gildane himself puts it. And here we must digress to say a word about our sources, for much of what happened in the years that followed happened behind closed doors, in the privacy of stairwells, council rooms, and bedchambers, and the full truth of it will likely never be known. We have of course the chronicles laid down by Grand Maester Runciter and his successors, and many a court document as well, all the royal decrees and proclamations, but these tell only a small part of the story. For the rest, we must look to accounts written decades later by the children and grandchildren of those caught up in the events of these times. Lords and knights reporting events witnessed by their forebears, third-hand recollections of aged serving men relating the scandals of their youth. Whilst these are undoubtedly of use, so much time passed between the event and the recording that many confusions and contradictions have inevitably crept in. Nor do these remembrances always agree. Unfortunately, this is also true of the two accounts by first-hand observers that have come down to us. Septon Eustache, who sept in the royal sept in the Red Keep during much of this time, and later rose to the ranks of the most devout, set down the most detailed history of this period. As a confidant and confessor to King Viserys and his queens, Eustache was well placed to know much and more of what went on, nor was he reticent about recording even the most shocking and salacious rumors and accusations, though the bulk of the reign of King Viserys, first of his name, and the Dance of the Dragons that came after, remains a sober and somewhat ponderous history. To balance Eustache, we have the testimony of Mushroom, based upon the verbal account of the courtful, set down by a scribe who failed to append his name, who at various times capered for the amusement of King Viserys, Princess Rhaenyra, and both Aegons, the second and third. A 3-foot-tall dwarf possessed of an enormous head and, pievers, an even more enormous member, Mushroom was thought feeble-minded, so kings and lords and princes did not scruple to hide their secrets from him. Whereas Septon Eustache records the secrets of bedchamber and brothel in hushed, condemnatory tones, Mushroom delights in the same, and his testimony consists of little but ribald tales and gossip, pudding stabbings, poisonings, betrayals, seductions, and debaucheries one atop the other. How much of this can be believed is a question the honest historian cannot hope to answer, but it is worth noting that King Baelor the Blessed decreed that every copy of Mushroom's chronicle should be burnt. Fortunately for us, a few escaped his fires. Septon Eustache and Mushroom do not always agree upon particulars, and at times their accounts are considerably at variance with one another, and with the court records and the chronicles of Grand Maester Runciter and his successors. Yet their tales do explain much and more that might otherwise seem puzzling, and later accounts confirm enough of their stories to suggest that they contain at least some portion of truth. The question of what to believe and what to doubt remains for each student to decide. Many accounts have come down to us of what was said and done that night. By far the most detailed and authoritative of them is Grand Maester Monkun's The Dance of the Dragons, a true telling. Though Monkun's exhaustive history was not written until a generation later and drew on many different sorts of materials, including Maester's chronicles, memoirs, steward's records, and interviews with 147 surviving witnesses to the great events of these times, his account of the inner working of the court relies upon the confessions of Grand Maester Orwell, as set down before his execution. Unlike Mushroom and Septon Eustache, whose version derived from rumors, hearsay, and family legend, the Grand Maester was present at the meeting and took part in the council's deliberations and decisions, though it must be recognized that, at the time he wrote, Orwell was most anxious to show himself in a favorable light and absolve himself of any blame for what was to follow. Monkun's true telling, therefore, paints his predecessor in perhaps too favorable a light. It is the more personal details that are most often a subject of interpretation, because there was no one that could feasibly overhear them, as a lot of it was happening behind closed doors. Mushroom, Orwell, and Eustace are most often invoked precisely in such situations, because they did witness some of it. Mushroom, for instance, was present during war councils of the Blacks. Orwell sat on the Green Council, and Eustace was a confessor of both Viserys and his queens. Yet even then, they did not know of everything that happened, and can often only speculate, or, in the case of Mushroom, create salacious gossip. They also had biases, and as such, their accounts did not agree on particulars. Thus, it is false to say that all of Fire and Blood is unreliable. What should instead be said is that the dance sections of Fire and Blood contain conflicting reports. The word unreliable should, in fact, never be used to describe this book as a whole, because for what we do know of Gildane's methodology, he did everything he should have to provide us with as detailed an account as possible. We may of course speculate on how much of this book is propaganda and how much of a bias did Gildane himself have, but from the actions he did take while writing his book, we see that he is a diligent practitioner of history. First, as mentioned previously, Gildane did not base his recollections solely on Mushroom, Eustace, and Orwell/Mooncoon. The basis of his dance chronicle was actually derived from court chroniclers, and whenever those did not entirely explain what happened, he turns to the testimony of Mushroom, the truth-telling, and the reign of King Viserys, first of his name, and the Dance of the Dragons that came after, since the people who wrote this often had access to more personal elements of the era. In the process, like a historian should, Gildane also makes sure to acknowledge what sort of biases his primary sources had. He notes that Mushroom was loyal to Rhaenyra, but tended to exaggerate many claims, repeat gossip, or make stuff up. He notes that Eustace disliked Rhaenyra and supported Aegon. And he notes that Orwell ultimately regretted some choices he made during the dance, and his testimony whitewashes himself. Note that Orwell's recollection was a primary source of Mooncoon's truth-telling, with truth-telling being a secondary source, which is why I refer to them as a team of sorts. Gildane makes sure to include all versions of events he has access to in order to provide as balanced of a recollection as he possibly can, and let the readers deduce themselves what version of events they find most plausible, if any at all. For this reason, he doesn't get to entirely exclude Mushroom, because he is one of the few people that lived during the dance and left some sort of a recollection of these events. He left a primary source. And it's not true that Mushroom is always lying or exaggerating. For instance, it is Mushroom who very plausibly claims that Adam and Alan were Corlys's children, not Laenor's. But Gildane himself knows that this particular statement is unverifiable. So whenever the topic of the paternity of these two figures arises, he makes sure to mention that they are either Corlys's children or grandchildren. I also don't think that the biases of the narrators were as strong as they're made out to be, much less difficult to decipher. Even Eustace is known to throw a bone at Rhaenyra at times, and even Mushroom becomes misogynistic when he insinuates that Rhaenyra's resentment towards Alicent grew when she remained skinny after several pregnancies while she gained weight. As I said, to me, to use the word unreliable in the context of Fire and Blood defeats the entire purpose of writing it and spits on the profession of a historian, even a fictional one, because Gildane does everything that is expected of him. He provides us with all sources possible, be it primary and secondary, to give us the fullest picture of the situation. That is the opposite of unreliable. Fire and Blood would have actually been more unreliable if, say, he had only included Eustace's account, because this way we would lack crucial insights that present us with alternative interpretations of some events. And once again, there really is not that much to be questioned in this book either. 99% of the time, when we don't know something, we are told we don't know something. And there's not as many instances of us not knowing something as fans of the unreliable history book mantra believe. There are even instances in which all the chroniclers agree with each other. All three chronicles agree on one particular. The first blood shed in the Dance of the Dragons belonged to Lord Lyman Beesbury, Master of Coin and Lord Treasurer of the Seven Kingdoms. Whenever these sources are conflicting, Gildane says so outright. And here again our sources differ. That night, Septon Eustace reports, Sir Criston Cole slipped into the princess's bedchamber to confess his love for her. He told Rhaenyra that he had a ship waiting on the bay and begged her to flee with him across the narrow sea. They would be wed in Tyrosh or Old Volantis, where her father's writ did not run, and no one would care that Sir Criston had betrayed his vows as a member of the Kingsguard. His prowess with sword and morning star was such that he did not doubt he could find some merchant prince to take him into service. But Rhaenyra refused him. She was the blood of the dragon, she reminded him, and meant for more than to live out her life as the wife of a common sellsword. And if he could set aside his Kingsguard vows, why would marriage vows mean any more to him? Masham tells a very different tale. In his version, it was Princess Rhaenyra who went to Sir Criston, not him to her. She found him alone in White Sword Tower, barred the door, and slipped off her cloak to reveal her nakedness underneath. "I saved my maidenhead for you," she told him. "Take it now as proof of my love. It will mean little and less to my betrothed, and perhaps when he learns that I am not chaste, he will refuse me." Yet for all her beauty, her entreaties fell on deaf ears, for Sir Criston was a man of honor and true to his vows. Even when Rhaenyra used the arts she had learned from her uncle Daemon, Cole would not be swayed. Scorned and furious, the princess donned her cloak again and swept out into the night, when she chanced to encounter Sir Harwin Strong, returning from a night of revelry in the stews of the city. Breakbones had long desired the princess, and lacked Sir Criston's scruples. It was he who took Rhaenyra's innocence, shedding her maiden's blood upon the sword of his manhood, according to Mushroom, who claims to have found them in bed at break of day. However it happened, whether the princess scorned the knight or he her, from that day forward the love that Sir Criston Cole had formerly borne for Rhaenyra Targaryen turned to loathing and disdain, and the man who had hitherto been the princess' constant companion and champion became the most bitter of her foes. Which one of those is more likely? From the previous reports, we know that Criston and Rhaenyra used to be very close. So close that, in fact, it was even the source of discomfort from Alicent of all people, as Rhaenyra met Criston when she was 7 and he was 23. Rhaenyra was reported to have been infatuated with Criston. It, however, seems rather unlikely that Criston would have soared on Rhaenyra this much for merely trying to seduce him. It seems more likely that Criston's bitterness arose from an incel facing a romantic rejection. But now, let's imagine if both these accounts had a seed of truth in it. Rhaenyra rejected Criston, and then he learned of her nonetheless entering an affair with Sir Harwin Strong. Now, would that not exacerbate the feelings of resentment of the spurned knight even more? Sometimes the narration also makes sure to remind us of the allegiances of everyone involved, so that we take it into account when we make our judgment. Septon Eustace, who had no love for the queen, tells us Rhaenyra laughed when she beheld the ruin of Sunfire the Golden. "Whose work is this?" he has her saying. "We must thank him." Mushroom, who had much love for the queen, tells a different tale. In his account, Rhaenyra says, "How has it come to this?" Another thing worth noting is that the dance sections of Fire and Blood were already written and published before. A bulk of the story was first revealed to us in The Princess and the Queen, a novella published in the Dangerous Women anthology. In The Princess and the Queen, the narrators of the dance have far less presence than they do in Fire and Blood. Note, for instance, the differences between the Green Council scene. "Until our new queen is crowned," Lord Beesbury said, in a waspish tone. "Until our new queen is crowned," someone said. In Grand Maester Munkun's account, the words are Orwell's, spoken softly, no more than a quibble. But Mushroom and Septon Eustace insist it was Lord Beesbury who spoke up, and in a waspish tone. Lord Beesbury spoke on behalf of Princess Rhaenyra. The ancient Master of Coin, who had served King Viserys for his entire reign, and his grandfather Jaehaerys the Old King before him, reminded the council that Rhaenyra was older than her brothers and had more Targaryen blood, that the late king had chosen her as his successor, that he had repeatedly refused to alter the succession despite the pleadings of Queen Alicent and her Greens, that hundreds of lords and landed knights had done obeisance to the princess in 105 AC, and sworn solemn oaths to defend her rights. In their accounts, only Lord Beesbury spoke on behalf of Rhaenyra. Grandmaster Orwell's account differs only in that he puts many of these arguments into his own mouth rather than Beesbury's, but subsequent events suggest that was not so, as we shall see. And so saying, he rose to go. But Sir Crichton Cole forced Lord Beesbury back into his seat and opened his throat with a dagger. And so the first blood shed in the Dance of the Dragons belonged to Lord Lyman Beesbury, Master of Coin and Lord Treasurer of the Seven Kingdoms. And so saying, he rose to go. As to what happened next, our sources differ. Grandmaster Orwell tells us that Lord Beesbury was seized at the door by the command of Sir Otto Hightower and escorted to the dungeons. Confined to a black cell, he would in time perish of a chill, whilst awaiting trial. Septon Eustace tells it elsewise. In his account, Sir Crichton Cole forced Lord Beesbury back into his seat and opened his throat with a dagger. Masham charges Sir Crichton with his lordship's death as well, but in his version, Cole grasped the old man by the back of his collar and flung him out of a window, to die impaled upon the iron spikes in the dry moat below. All three chronicles agree on one particular. The first blood shed in the Dance of the Dragons belonged to Lord Lyman Beesbury, Master of Coin and Lord Treasurer of the Seven Kingdoms. With the princess in confinement on Dragonstone, about to give birth, Queen Alicent's greens enjoyed an advantage. The longer Rhaenyra remained ignorant of the king's death, the slower she would be to move. "Mayhaps the whore will die in childbirth," Queen Alicent said. With the prince's confinement on Dragonstone, about to give birth, Queen Alicent's greens enjoyed an advantage. The longer Rhaenyra remained ignorant of the king's death, the slower she would be to move. "Mayhaps the whore will die in childbirth," Queen Alicent is reported to have said, according to Mushroom. Generally, the newer edition of the book should be taken into account first and foremost, especially since, for example, Rhaenys the Queen Who Never Was has silver hair in The Princess and the Queen, but that was changed to black in Fire and Blood due to her Baratheon heritage. But it's still an interesting thing to ponder about. For example, The Princess and the Queen does not mention that Alicent said, "Mayhaps the whore will die in childbirth," only according to Mushroom. It's stated as a factual thing she uttered. Nor is there placed any doubt on the way Lord Beesbury died. Crichton is said to have slit his throat. It's worth comparing these two accounts and deciding how that should influence our reading of events on a case-by-case basis. For example, I think it's reasonable to say that Crichton indeed slit Lord Beesbury's throat, but that Alicent likely did not say that bit. And so on and so forth. Another digression that I felt was worth including, but that's the thing with me. I think all digressions are worth including. If we take into account the biases of each primary source into account, then most of the time we can deduce who is telling the truth, who is exaggerating, and so on. In fact, there's far more things in the Dance Chronicle that are stated as a fact than those put into question. Thus, there are things that absolutely cannot be seriously questioned. Or rather, if someone questions them, they reveal that they did not comprehend what they are reading, did not read the book at all, or never actually interacted with real historical writing prior. And that becomes apparent with how can such people in earnest appeal to the unreliability of Fire and Blood in instances such as character ages, the timeline, the fundamental nature of relationships between characters, and their placement in space and time. And sometimes, even their very existence. Certainly, a lot of this has been exacerbated, if not outright caused, by the TV show House of the Dragon. I want to dedicate a separate segment to the issues the adaptation caused, but to lay a coherent groundwork for it, we must first once more return to how primary and secondary sources inform our understanding of history, because quite a lot of instances in real history do reflect the same trends as we see in Fire and Blood. Let us take, for instance, the figure of Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen of England. Like with the case of Gildane using court documents to report the ages of characters at certain points in time, the years where some people died, the years in which certain significant events happened, the same can be said about Queen Elizabeth I, of whom we know for certain was born on 7th September 1533, a date most certainly recorded in court documents and a significant enough date for many people to have remembered it and corroborated it. We know that she had ascended the throne on November 17th, 1558, aged 25. Another event that was certainly recorded by chronicles and corroborated by people who lived in that era. We know that her reign ended in 1603, with her death at age 45. Famously, Elizabeth I refused to marry or have children, which earned her the famous moniker. But as to why, our sources disagree. Early on in her reign, Elizabeth had proclaimed that she was already bound onto a husband, which is the Kingdom of England. Certainly, the most important aspect of Elizabeth's refusal to marry was the fact that a husband would undermine her authority as a female monarch in her own right. A monarch was a sovereign over a country, but a husband was a sovereign over the wife, which would make him above her in hierarchy. It was Elizabeth's wish to be a figure of an almost sexless and genderless authority, as exemplified by her famous speech, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." This was certainly the crucial factor, but by no means the only one, for Elizabeth was recorded to have already declared her refusal to marry at the ripe old age of 8, before she could reasonably conceive of her right as a virgin queen. There were other factors as well. Had she married a foreign king like her sister Mary I, the English court would have found itself with some unsavory influences, particularly if the husband-to-be was a Catholic. And had she married a respectful Englishman, jealousy of other suitors would have endangered her and her rule. There were also many and numerous personal reasons as to why Elizabeth was scornful to the idea of marriage. She had seen numerous unions of her family break down, often in horrific ways. Her own father had her mother, Anne Boleyn, beheaded on most likely false charges, and the same fate awaited her stepmother, Catherine Howard. She had also witnessed numerous women die in childbirth, which would explain her reluctance for getting pregnant and giving birth. A pregnancy is also a very vulnerable state for a woman, so in the time she was waiting to give birth, her grip on power would have loosened. Elizabeth's love life has, thus, puzzled historians for centuries. As the literal queen, she of course had many suitors and was known to have certain favorites and male companions. Robert Dudley is perhaps the most famous of them, but there were others as well, and it can never be conclusively decided whether there was something more, or if they remained platonic, much less whether any of these unions have been consummated. Elizabeth swore solemnly on her deathbed that she remained the Virgin Queen, but can we ever be sure of that? All of this is very similar to Rhaenyra. While she was no Virgin Queen, her love life was a subject of speculations and rumors as well. What exactly happened between her and Criston? Was Daemon's seduction of her the reason for his exile? Was Harwin truly her lover and the father of her children? Mushroom says so openly, while Eustace brings it up only to dismiss it. The Mushroom who loved her and the Eustace who hated her, no less. So, we don't know for sure, and probably never will. And like with Elizabeth, we know exactly when Rhaenyra was born. 97 AC. We know when she died, 22nd day of the 10th moon in the year 130 AC, age 33. We know when she was named as heir, at age 8. We even know her personality and appearance, which were described by the author 12 years before the release of Fire and Blood and corroborated in that unreliable history book. You will probably want to paint Rhaenyra as she was at her father's death, when she laid claim to the Iron Throne. Pampered from an early age, she was a pudgy girl and a stout woman, with a thick waist and a very large bosom. She was very proud and stubborn, and there was a certain petulance to her small mouth. Rhaenyra did have the silver gold hair of the Targaryens, which she wore long and braided in the manner of Aegon I's warrior's wife Visenya. Rhaenyra was no warrior herself. She always dressed richly, favoring purple and maroon velvets and golden Mirish lace in intricate patterns. Her bodice often glittered with pearls and diamonds, and there were always rings on her fingers. Whenever she was anxious, she would turn them compulsively, round and round. Though Rhaenyra could be charming, she was quick to anger and never forgot a slight. During the Dance of the Dragons, she wore her father's crown. Another factor worth mentioning is that the Dance of the Dragons really isn't that far removed from the current timeline. 169 years passed between the year of 131 AC, when the dance ended, and the year 300 AC, which is the current year in the main books. To put things into perspective, 169 years ago, in the year of 1855, Tsar Alexander II, born 29th of April 1818, ascends the Russian throne. Kierkegaard, born 5th May 1813, dies. Walt Whitman, born 31st May 1819, publishes Leaves of Grass. It is very much a fairly recent history for them. We know the exact dates of birth of numerous figures much more far removed from us. For example, we know that Julius Caesar was born on 12 July 100 BC. We have the exact date of birth of a guy who lived before Jesus Christ. In order to continue to insist that the entire book should be questioned, up to and including character ages, the timeline of events, the placement of characters in place in time, or their very existence, we would have to assume that some extreme form of foul play was involved. If these aspects of the story are unreliable, then that means that all the court chronicles either were awful at their job, or that they collaborated together to wrongly report these events out of nothing but pure malice. Not only that, nobody has ever corrected them. Not the Citadel, to which they were directly responding to, nor any other historians or chronicles who could have found discrepancies in their primary sources. That means that either they were equally inept in their job, or that they were in it all along, which means that there was an entire conspiracy to wrongly report on these events. If we assume the former, then that means that the Citadel as an institution cannot be trusted with boiling an egg, much less doing any science. If we assume the latter, then that begs the question, what was the point of all this? Who would have anything to gain from this? To have a bias is one thing. To purposely lie about the basic, verifiable facts of the story at large is another. Who did this, and for what reason then? Surely, such massive and blatant forgery should have some consequences, mayhaps even become a major plot point. Yet, there is not as much as a single hint that such a massive heist ever took place. Nobody mentions it. Not the characters, not the author, nobody. To give this scrutiny a Doylist dimension, the author himself said that the differing accounts are there mostly because he sometimes has more than one idea on how these scenes should happen and just wants to include both. He never as much as implies that there is something more to it. What is more likely then? That there is an entire huge conspiracy that's been upheld for 2 centuries and there was not even one whistleblower in the Citadel. Or that there are certain hard facts in this story that are not and have never been up to interpretation. Nobody is required to know how to engage with primary and secondary sources or analyze historical documents, nor should they be required to possess that skill in order to read and enjoy Fire and Blood. But if that's the case, just enjoy the story instead of offering your hot takes without giving a single thought as to what it would imply. No investigation, no right to speak. Because the implication of the mindless, unreliable history book mantra used by people who have never read a source in their life makes it so that Fire and Blood becomes not a historical novel, but a choose-your-own-adventure story. Another poignant question is, what is the boundary of said unreliability? Because if even the stone-cold facts were not relayed to us faithfully, that begs the question, what actually was? If this error was allowed to be replicated with ignorance, or worse, malice, then the only purpose of this book is to make a nice campfire out of it. If everything is to be questioned, then everything is to be questioned, and there is no interpretation that is too far-fetched. Let me claim that none of this ever happened, and none of these people ever existed in the universe. Mushroom, Eustace, Moonkun, and Orwell were the same exact person using different pen names, and he made up the entire story for fun, passing it off as real history. The Citadel then accepted this unquestionably, as a factual thing that happened. You dare question my amazing new theory? Have you forgotten that fire and blood is unreliable? Of course, none of the fans of the unreliable fire and blood mantra ever think of it this deeply, because none of them were ever willing to engage with the text in good faith. It's easy to use this unreliable history book excuse whenever any discussion arises, much more difficult to think what it would entail. That is not to say that there are always clear-cut answers in history. You may, for instance, ponder about the relationship between Robert Dudley and Elizabeth I. But if you were to suddenly announce that actually Elizabeth was born in 1543 and not 1533, she and Robert Dudley secretly married and she had 3 kids nobody ever knew about. And also, her cousin bursted through the floor on the back of the Loch Ness Monster, but none of this was ever recorded because all court chronicles were propagandists with an agenda. You would rightfully be labeled a conspiracy theorist and possibly even an insane person. Maybe it should not concern us at all, given that this is just a fictional history book detailing fictional history. Nah, I'm sorry, but it should absolutely concern us, because it reveals some fundamental illiteracy. We are told outright when something is unknown to us, and there's zero reason to question 90% of the things that are questioned on a regular basis. After all, these people never existed, and the book was written by one guy who probably thought of it all far less than any of us ever did. And most of the mysteries in Fire and Blood are not meant to be too convoluted to be solved either. And most of Fire and Blood isn't a mystery either. What we deal with here is some mass Dunning-Kruger effect. And to be perfectly frank here, I'm not a historian either, though in my life I've dealt with both primary and secondary sources. Which is why, even as an amateur who doesn't even like doing it that much, I'm able to call bullshit on this mantra. Frankly, I imagine that a great deal of people who use this excuse never even touched the book and may as well just repeat what they saw online. But this claim had to originate somewhere. Some people who did read the book must have started it for it to become the go-to talking point about Fire and Blood. I imagine that the reason was precisely lack of prior engagement with historical documents, but also the dislike towards the book itself. If you dislike what you read and are also given this convenient excuse, then you can project whatever you want on the book, even distort it, to fuel your specific agenda or ideas. And there is one specific offender that does this the most. It's hard to give a clear definition of what is, or was, the golden age of television, nor when it started and ended, nor if it even existed at all. Alexis Pichard, a French academic, was possibly the first one to describe the surge of quality of television productions as such, with shows such as Breaking Bad, The Sopranos, and Mad Men getting cited as the examples most often. At the same time, these prestige TV shows were getting released to critical acclaim, exactly as many, if not more, absolute slobs were being produced, questioning the use of this term in the first place. Assuming that the golden age of TV was indeed a thing, the 2000s are generally pinpointed as its start, particularly with The Sopranos, with the Writers Guild of America naming it as the greatest show of all time. Some, however, insist that the golden age of television was rather short-lived, and that it already ended. The endings of Mad Men and sometimes Succession are often considered to be death throes. The rise of streaming and the pandemic deeply influenced how television shows are pitched and produced, with quantity over quality taking precedence once more. Numerous shows get ordered, then cancelled after one season, with the execution being, pardon my French, half-assed. Netflix especially is believed to be one of the prime offenders, having cancelled 20 shows after one season in 2022 alone. Netflix's business model relies on numbers, not critic reviews, and if the show doesn't instantly become one of the top 10 most watched, it tends to land in the cancellation bin. Once you look at what TV these days has to offer, You will soon see that most of it is a prequel, a game adaptation, a sequel, a book adaptation, a reboot, some adaptation of something again. Even the cinema was not spared from this, though by virtue of being a different medium, original movies are still being produced to critical acclaim. That seems to be severely dwindling in the case of TV. TV shows too used to run for many seasons, consisting of many episodes, but as our attention spans get shorter and shorter, TV seasons followed suit. The business method of streaming services prioritizing numbers shot prestige TV at point blank. Breaking Bad took its sweet time to reach the status and iconicity it has today, but with the rise of streaming and the quantity over quality model, if a series isn't an instant hit, it's killed before it reasonably can take wing. The more quirky and bold the idea behind the show is, the more likely that it will get cancelled, if not outright killed at the inception, as audiences are less likely to venture into what might be different from what they know. Original ideas have become harder to sell. The prestige cable days of Mad Men and Nurse Jackie became the prestige streaming era of The Handmaid's Tale and Stranger Things, which has given way to the algorithm and IP-fueled hellscape of superheroes, mergers, and HBO Max becoming plain old Max. More shows are headlined by movie stars, who come with large salaries and constricted schedules. Neighbors doubt that Swarm would get greenlighted now, even though it just got through a year ago. Right now, especially with the strike looming, people are afraid of weird stuff, she said. They want Yellowstone. They want This Is Us. Those shows are great, but not everyone wants to write that show. Lila Björk, who has written for the HBO series The Leftovers and Watchmen, lamented. What these streamers want most right now is second screen content, where you can be on your phone while it's on. Or you can write an original script everyone loves, and then it's like, oh, we can make this, but please take your pick of the upcoming Batman projects. A sure way to get the views necessary is to create precisely an adaptation, a spin-off, a sequel or a prequel, since fans of the original will flock to see their beloved story, giving streaming services their desired numbers. But that makes the work of screenwriters all that more limiting. After all, they are merely adapting someone else's work, and if the author insists on heavy creative control, that means less creative freedom for them. The less original shows are pitched, the bigger the frustration. Everyone loses. Fans are pissed because of the changes. Screenwriters are pissed because nobody greenlights their original ideas anymore. And authors of the original work are pissed because their work gets disrespected. Everywhere you look, there are more screenwriters and producers eager to take great stories and make them their own. No matter how major a writer is, no matter how great the book, there always seems to be someone on hand who thinks he can do better, eager to take the story and improve on it. The book is the book, the film is the film, they will tell you, as if they were saying something profound. Then they make the story their own. They never make it better though. 999 times out of 1,000, they make it worse. It's possible to understand why some screenwriters squeeze any sort of creativity they can from these limited options. Why, George R. R. Martin's words, they make it their own. You may agree or disagree with their choices, but it's important to understand that, most of the time, they don't do it out of malice. That being said, I value honesty. If a showrunner or screenwriter says, I'm altering the source material to make it my own because I'm not allowed to explore my creativity in other ways, that's one thing. But if a showrunner or screenwriter says, I piss on the source material, but also use it to prop up my bogus narrative developments, that's something else entirely.
There was this line in the book that always fascinated me. Damon's wife, the Lady Rhea Royce of Runestone, fell off her horse and her skull was crushed in the fall. And I read that and I was like, that's such a weird detail to include with no context around it. So I stared at it and I was like, well, Damon obviously went home and murdered his wife.
Weird detail to include with no context around it. Is this what he said? A year later, in 115 AC, there came a tragic mishap, of the sort that shapes the destiny of kingdoms. The bronze bitch of Runestone, Lady Rhea Royce, fell from her horse, Willis Hawking, and cracked her skull upon a stone. She lingered for 9 days before finally feeling well enough to leave her bed, only to collapse and die within an hour of raising. That surely seems like quite a lot of context given to this particular situation, does it not? And Daemon obviously went home and murdered his wife, did he? A raven was duly sent to Storm's End, and Lord Baratheon dispatched a messenger by ship to Bloodstone, where Prince Daemon was still struggling to defend his meager kingdom against the men of the Triarchy and their Dornish allies. Daemon flew at once for the Vale. To put my wife to rest, he said, though more like it was in the hopes of laying claim to her lands, castles, and incomes. See, if Condal said, I am doing an adaptation, and as such, it's not going to be the same as the books. My Daemon is different. My Daemon is a villain. My Daemon killed Rhea. But in the books he didn't, and that's fine, because these are different canons. That would be passably okay and theoretically within his rights as a person in charge of an adaptation. How that shows his fundamental lack of understanding of the source material is another matter entirely. But in these 3 sentences, Condal lied twice. First by saying that in the book it's a detail included with no context, which it is not, and then by insisting that Daemon obviously went home and killed his wife, even though in the very next sentence that he allegedly read, it's explained that he was in the Stepstones. There were quite a lot of people in these Stepstones at the time. Even if Daemon's appearance in the Vale was unnoticed, his absence at the Stepstones would have been noted. But we know for sure that he only flew to the Vale after Rhea Royce died. And not only that, some time passed in between those events, because Rhea lingered for 9 days, during which she had plenty of time and opportunity to report that something suspicious was afoot. She even managed to rise from her bed for an hour, during which time she still hadn't said that there was something suspicious about the hunting incident, nor had she reported memory loss either. Only then she died, and only then was the message sent from the Vale to Storm's End, from which it reached Daemon's ears in the Stepstones, and only then did he depart from the islands to claim his wife's inheritance. He physically couldn't have been in the Vale at the time, and even if he hired someone to make Rhea have that accident, that somehow hadn't crossed anyone's mind. None of the sources of Fire and Blood ever considered this to be suspicious, even though every time some mysterious death happens, someone finds a way to implicate Daemon. Now you have claims left and right that Daemon murdered his first wife. When you say that no, this isn't how it happened, you know what you can expect. Unreliable history book. Then why stop ourselves here? If everything ought to be questioned, then let's indeed question everything. Who is to say that Daemon hired Blood and Cheese? Suspicious. Actually, none of this happened. J. Harris was killed in an accident, and historians painted Daemon as the culprit to demonize him. Like many readers of Fire and Blood, Condal saw what he wanted to see, and the mantra of unreliable book enabled him to think himself vindicated in that perception. He saw it because he is known to dislike Daemon. He said that he is surprised by his popularity, especially after he worked tirelessly to make him a worse person than he is in the books. I have spoken many times about how visual mediums affect our perception of the source material, and while in the case of, say, Game of Thrones, that impact is largely subconscious, with House of the Dragon and Fire and Blood, it is encouraged to not just merge these mediums, but outright consider the adaptation to be paramount to the source material. Throw a stone if you hadn't seen someone claim that the show is actually how it really happened. Wrong ages, messed up timeline, and people who very much existed, not existing anymore, notwithstanding. All thanks to Condal's endless appeals to unreliability, which allowed him impunity for any and all creative choices he makes. He sort of trained his own audience to jump in his defense using this excuse as well. In the process, nobody has ever thought what any of this would imply, and here we are, stuck with the mass Dunning-Kruger effect, being the article of faith. Condal is a screenwriter, not a historian. He is by no means required to know how to engage with historical sources. All he needed to do is to be honest and say, "We're doing my own thing, and it was never our intention to adapt the book faithfully." But this isn't what he's doing. Sure, he will at times highlight the difference of mediums, the separate canons, But then he undermines it every time he says something like, oh yeah, this dogshit scene everyone hated, we included it because in the histories it wouldn't have been recorded, as nobody was present to witness it, to absolve himself of absurd narrative choices, rather than to just be honest. I wanted this scene to happen, hence I included it, and I can 100% do so because I'm doing an adaptation. Sure, I would still consider what he's doing a butchery of the source material and a low-quality, high-budget fanfic, but at least the difference in mediums would have been made clear from the start. In fact, the rhetoric he uses every time he heavily diverges from the source material to imply that it's within the realm of possibility shows that he is not at all confident in his choices. No. You don't get to explain the discrepancies in ages, years of births and deaths, people's very existence, and the events as significant as a dragon bursting through the floor as unreliable history. This excuse doesn't hold water under the slightest scrutiny, and the fact that there's very little scrutiny of it is a problem. Fire and Blood does not consist solely of conflicting reports. Far from it. There are court chronicles. There are witness testimonies. Surely, at least one person would have remembered a dragon bursting through the floor and relayed it somewhere. Surely, a maester at the High Tower would have known if Alicent was actually of age with Rhaenyra, as opposed to being a decade her senior. Surely, Maelor and Nettles weren't just hallucinations. Yes, the medium of book-to-screen adaptations has different rules. Yes, with nothing but dry facts, he had to fill in the blanks. The thing is, most of the time, he didn't fill in the blanks. Often he removed key events from the book without substituting it with anything else, because he was plainly disinterested with the actual setup for the Dance of the Dragons, and wanted epic dragon battles right this instant. And if only he were honest about it, I probably wouldn't give a damn. But he's not honest, never has been. And that's what I have a problem with. The key problem with the Dance era of Fire and Blood is the lack of solid sources, but the lack of solid sources does not make the book unreliable. It makes the sources unreliable, and not unreliable to the point that everything is and has always been up to interpretation, and that we cannot discern the truth from myths. Archmaester Gildain did everything expected of him. He found all the sources. He included all of them in his recollection of events. He mentioned their biases and usually refrained from judgment on his own. That is proof of his good scholarship. The invocation of unreliable book in the cases of easily verifiable facts is deeply, deeply absurd and leads to fallacies of unreal proportions. Of course, nobody ever thinks of what it would entail, since it's easier to offer Watsonian explanations for clearly Doylist matters. The source material is unreliable, sounds much better than the screenwriters included this because they wanted to. Thanks for watching. Remember that if you like my content, like, subscribe and share so that more people can see it. Make sure to click the notification button so that you never miss a new video. And remember, Phoenix rises from the ashes and ashes always land on top.